Open up your Bibles this morning to Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19. Or if you're using the YouVersion Bible app, you can tap on the left-hand side, the live events section, then tap on search for live events, and all this morning's notes and scriptures are right there for you. Back in the 90s, there was a man whose name was Reed. Reed liked movies. He liked TV shows. He liked being able to get them. He liked going up to Blockbuster and renting them. Some of you younger ones may not know what Blockbuster is. They used to have these big rectangles you could rent from them that said "Be Kind, Rewind" on them. And then those were phased out and DVDs came in. But Reed really liked this. But he thought, as many great ideas begin with this question, as he went about this and took this, renting these things, watching them, he thought there's got to be a better way. And so Reed had this idea and started a company, and they began to do this of mailing DVDs to people's houses instead of them having to go to the store on the corner and pick them up. And so the business did okay, but as time went on, they began to lose money pretty dramatically. They were, at the time, the only online presence of a company that did this. You would go online, sign up for a subscription, and for $20 a month, they would send you an unlimited number of DVDs, one at a time, and you could rent movies that way. But this wasn't really working out for them as they were losing money, and so he scheduled a meeting with the heads of Blockbuster. And Reed flew down to Blockbuster headquarters and met with the guys there and proposed something to them. Because at the time, Blockbuster didn't have any kind of online presence. Everything they did was based in the store. You went in, you rented your deal, you brought it back in 2 days or 3 days or whatever. And this was the year 2000. He had this meeting, Reed did, with the Blockbuster guys. And he said, "I'll let you have my business. You can buy it for $50 million. And we will," he said, "my company will essentially be your online presence. You have the store deal. We will also just become a part of Blockbuster. We'll become Blockbuster.com, and we'll mail DVDs to people." Blockbuster heard this pitch, and they said, "Well, you know what? We don't really need that." He said, "You've got 300,000 subscribers. That's great, but that really doesn't help us. We've got the market cornered on renting videos. We don't need an online presence. Our long-term plan is to keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to be doing it forever." You can imagine how that is going to go. Well, Reed walked out the door of Blockbuster a little dejected, a little discouraged. And he went back to his guys and he said, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, but we're going to look to the future and look to what could possibly be next. There's got to be even a better way of doing our better way. And so as they begin to do research and as they begin to think about what they were doing, from the year 2000, the next 7 years, they plugged a lot of money into forward-thinking research. And then in the year 2007, Reed launched online streaming for Netflix, was his company. And they started online streaming in the year 2007. And as time went on, Netflix put Blockbuster out of business. Netflix, that Blockbuster could have bought for $50 million, as of this morning, I checked it, Netflix is worth $25.09 billion. That's a significant uptick. Where they had 300,000 subscribers in the year 2000, today they have 31 million subscribers. And now Blockbuster is bankrupt, missing out on an opportunity because their long-term plan wasn't long enough. And just a little anecdote for you. In the peak internet hours, 1/3 of all North American internet traffic is Netflix. Twice as much as YouTube. Netflix has a dominating presence because for them, long-term plans was more than continuing to do what we're already doing in a limited market. And so Blockbuster missed out. They should have changed their perspective about what long-term planning really is, what really is a long-term plan. And we're going to see a little bit of long-term planning here in Luke chapter 19. You see, when we get to Luke chapter 19, we come across Jesus and his disciples. They're on their way to Jerusalem for Jesus to be crucified and to raise from the dead. The next city on their march here in the book of Luke to Jerusalem is Jericho. Now, Jericho has a very long history. Jericho is the lowest city in the world. There is no occupied city sitting at a lower point in the world. But Jericho in particular is not the Jericho of the Old Testament. It is a little bit away from that Jericho because the Jericho of the Old Testament was cursed, that anyone who would try to rebuild it, that they would suffer great loss. And many men have tried to rebuild the old city. One guy in particular in 1 Kings chapter 16 lost 2 of his sons in the efforts to try to rebuild the cursed Jericho. And so they eventually built this other Jericho a little bit away in an oasis in the Judean desert, and that's where this Jericho is located there. But another point about this Jericho, it's an ancient city. It is the oldest and longest consecutively occupied city in the world, essentially being occupied since creation. They can date it back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so Jesus, he is walking into Jericho. And right before he gets there in Luke 19, as he's walking into the city, he comes across a man who's on the side of the road, a blind man. That he comes across there. And that blind man would have sat there day after day because of his condition in that society, in that day and time. He was unable to work. And so he'd sit by the road on the way into Jericho, and he would yell out for passersby to give him money. He would beg. And so he hears this large crowd traveling. He hears people in the crowd mention Jesus is in the crowd. And he has heard, undoubtedly, many stories about Jesus. Jesus has healed blind people before. Jesus has done great things before. And so the blind man begins to shout over the crowd, trying to get Jesus' attention. And they try to stifle his voice, the crowd does. But the man, being quite persistent, shouts all the louder. Jesus hears this man's cry. He stops the entire procession in the middle of the road, inconveniences everyone trying to get close to Jesus so that he can interact with this blind man on the side of the road. And he asks that man an incredible question. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" I try to imagine the Son of God asking you that. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked this man for the desire of his heart, and this man pours out his heart to Jesus. He said he wanted to see. And so Jesus immediately gave the man sight without pretense, without hesitation. The man called out to Jesus, and Jesus forever changed his life spiritually and physically. And then Jesus walks into Jericho. Look at verse 1 of Luke 19. He entered Jericho and was passing through. Now, just in that verse, it seems like a setup. It doesn't seem like a lot of information, but Jesus goes into Jericho with a purpose. It says he was passing through. Jesus was going to die. He was going to raise from the dead. But, as we're going to see, even though Jesus is passing through Jericho to a greater purpose, he's not so task-oriented that he ignores those around him. You know, for instance, we just saw, he saw the guy, the blind man on the side of the road, and healed him. And now he is going through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem, and he is, in the same way, not going to ignore those he comes across. Even though his disciples know we're headed to Jerusalem, I got to keep the crowd back off of Jesus so we can get where we need to go. We got dinner reservations at Bethany. We got to get there quick. And so they're trying to move along to what you've got to do. You know, a lot of times I'm that way. You know, if I've got a time, I've got to be somewhere, the preceding moments are incredibly stressful, trying to get out the door or trying to get things organized. I can remember as a kid, I was even that way. way is we would get packed for a trip, and my mom is the opposite of that way. She did everything at the last possible second, and she would get incredibly stressed, which if mom gets incredibly stressed, the whole house gets incredibly stressed, and I was already stressed as a kid because we're late, and that drove me nuts. And so we're running out the door, trying to get somewhere, trying to focus on what we're doing, oftentimes ignoring all the other things around us, including at one time my sister's luggage that we got to where we were, and she didn't have any clothes or toothbrushes or anything, but it didn't bother me. I had mine. And so Jesus' disciples are trying to help him get through the city, keep the crowds back, get to where they're going, keep people off of Jesus. And they're thinking about, we've got to pass through Jericho. We've got to keep moving. We can't stop. But with Jesus, that's not the way he operates. He is always aware of his surroundings. Even though Jesus, it says there, is passing through, he's not simply passing through. He is always looking around him at what could possibly be there. He is moving right along, but looking around him at what is. And now, what's interesting is what is around him. We're going to be introduced to what is around him in the next verse. Look at verse 2. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. So we meet a man named Zacchaeus, and his name is so fantastic that a world-famous song has been written about him that I'm sure many of you know. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and there you go. He climbed up in that sycamore tree. There you go. That's it. But the thing about Zacchaeus is he's not just a tax collector. You see there, he is a chief tax collector. And that position was not very common back in this day. Had to be something special about Zacchaeus and special about Jericho that would have warranted a chief tax collector. And the thing about Jericho is that it is a very strategic place. It was a toll place for Rome because it was a well-used trade route on the way to the east, to trade with the countries out to the east. The companies would have to pass through Jericho, pass right by Jericho to head out that way to sell their wares and come back. And so they would have to pay their taxes there in Jericho to move on through to where they were going. But in addition to that, there was a great balsam grove nearby. And so there was a flourishing local economy as well. So not only were there passing taxes, there were also great local taxes. And so the chief tax collector would have been desperately needed, not only with their regional tax collectors, but they would have all reported to Zacchaeus, collecting the money, getting them where they needed to go. And that would have made Zacchaeus incredibly wealthy. And the verse notes that he was rich. We don't get very often in Scripture a person's wealth mentioned. We do about some guys, but not about a whole bunch of guys. But here with Zacchaeus, we find out that he is wealthy. And now, naturally, he would be as a tax collector, and even more so as a chief tax collector. Tax collectors in society have never been the most popular of people. Even though they're typically just trying to do their jobs, they're not really popular because they're taking your money. And even more so here in the ancient Roman Empire, because tax collectors were liars and deceivers. Tax collectors were thieves. They were dishonest with their work. Now, the people above them, the higher-ups in the organization, the Roman Empire, didn't care if they were dishonest as long as they got their money too. It didn't matter. What would happen is the tax collectors would say, here's your tax, but in the middle of the tax, not just was the money they had to send to the government and their own salary, they would tack on additional money that they could take home and do with whatever they wanted. And so Zacchaeus, being a chief tax collector, he would also tack on extra. So the regular tax collectors had their extra money they're stealing. Then Zacchaeus, on top of that, has his extra stealing fee that he's going to take. And so he is the most hated man in Jericho because he is not only stealing, he's leading all of these other tax collectors to steal from the people. But in addition to that, Jews especially did not like tax collectors, especially Jewish tax collectors because they represented the Roman oppression that was bound to the Jews of that day. And so a Jew who was working for the Roman government, being dishonest by taking money that wasn't theirs to take from the Jews, made them hated all the more. And so you have Zacchaeus there in this city, hated by so many people in the city, being a tax collector, a chief tax collector. But nobody could do anything about it. Because Zacchaeus, being an employee of the Roman government, he was protected by Rome and by its soldiers. But that didn't deter the people in their dislike of him. Look at verse 3. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was small in stature. There's a couple of very interesting things in that verse. We see Zacchaeus pursued Jesus. He wanted to know if all of the stories he'd been hearing about Jesus were true. Could this Jesus passing through Jericho possibly be the rescuer that Zacchaeus desperately needed, and we see longed for? That even though Zacchaeus, his entire occupation was bound up in lying, in sin, he still wanted to know Jesus. You know, he's alone in this city of people who despise him. He needs help. He is a sinner in need of help, just like all of us. And his job had a daily repeated sin in deceiving, lying, stealing in order to further his own position. But even so, he wanted to see Jesus, but was limited by his own physical stature. For him, gravity was stronger than his growth plates. His limitation hindered his pursuit of Jesus. But what I find fascinating in that verse, it says, on account of the crowd, he could not see Jesus. The people around Jesus, he had his disciples around him, he had the crowd around him that were traveling with him. The people around Jesus prevented this man from coming closer to Jesus. The people closest to Jesus, his disciples, prevented, even by subconsciously, without unintentionally, prevented Zacchaeus from seeing Jesus. They were too focused on passing through Jericho to notice somebody in the periphery, somebody on the sidelines who was ready and willing to come to Jesus. Zacchaeus, he demonstrated potential faith in wanting to come to Jesus. He was ready to know Jesus. He wanted to experience Jesus. And the thing about Jesus, as we're going to see in a moment, he shows us time and time again that the destination and the task, though they are important, they are not so important that the journey becomes mundane and obsolete. Neglecting those along the journey negates the purpose of the destination. If Jesus is going to die and raise from the dead for all people, then he can't simply ignore all people on his way to die and raise from the dead. But the disciples miss this. The disciples don't see this or pick up on it. They didn't pay any mind to somebody who was right there ready to know Jesus, somebody who was in desperate need of Jesus. All they thought was they needed to clear the way so Jesus could move right along to where he was going. We see Jesus, he is determined in his forward motion. It says he's passing through. He's determined in moving forward, but he is always ready to stop and pick up more passengers. We may think that we need to keep our eyes on the destination, but we need to have an awareness of the sidelines. Jesus kept his eyes on the sidelines and a peripheral focus on the destination. Jesus knew where he was going, but he intentionally looked around him into the faces of the people that were near him so he could intervene in their lives. And Zacchaeus wanted to know Jesus. And Jesus was ready to accommodate him. Look at verse 4. Speaking of Zacchaeus not being able to see Jesus, it says, so he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. So Zacchaeus runs down the road ahead of where Jesus and the crowd are passing. There's a tree there that he scurries up. And now we know from history and from archaeology, Jericho being in an oasis there in the Judean desert, there were trees all over the place. There were parks all over the place. Trees lined the roads. And so Zacchaeus just ran down there and climbed up a sycamore tree. And this particular sycamore tree in this part of the world, it's a fig mulberry tree. I have no idea what that is. I looked it up. But this kind of tree has a short trunk and very long, wide branches. So it would have been a very good climbing tree, and Zacchaeus seized the opportunity there. He wanted to see if Jesus' claims are verifiable. He's hopeful. He wants to believe, but first he has to lay eyes on Jesus himself. So Zacchaeus takes the initiative. He is very intentional about trying to encounter Jesus, running out there, climbing up this tree. And he's expecting Jesus to do something. He's anticipating Jesus doing something. But as often the case with Jesus, Jesus is about to far exceed his expectations. Verse 5. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So walking down the road, Jesus comes up to where Zacchaeus has positioned himself up in that tree. Jesus stops the entire procession. He just did that before he walked into the city when the blind man was on the side of the road. And now he does it again. He stops everybody. And in that moment, he halted everyone's assumptions. They thought he was moving one way, and Jesus was about to change their schedule that day. Zacchaeus anticipated Jesus just passing right on by on his way through the city. But Jesus wasn't about to live up to those expectations or the expectations of the crowd. He was about to blow them all away. He inconvenienced everyone in the crowd by stopping them in order to address the immediate need of somebody who needed him. Jesus cared so much for Zacchaeus in the moment that he didn't worry about whatever plans or reservations the disciples had already made for their lodgings and meals or what everybody thought about him. All he cared about was the heart of somebody who needed him. Jesus, in our own perspective, he cares more about you than anyone's plan for your life, including your own. Jesus is deeply invested in you, wanting to know him and experience him. You know, Zacchaeus had thought that his day was going to go a certain way, that it was going to end a certain way, but Jesus dramatically changed it. He said, Zacchaeus, I'm going to your house today. Now, you got to think about Zacchaeus in that moment. You know, he's heard a lot about Jesus, this great man. He's done so many great things. Do you think Zacchaeus had the thought, I wonder if I cleaned this morning? I wonder if I left the sink dirty. Jesus is coming to my house with his 12 disciples, and who knows how many rest of this crowd are going to come into my house, and I left the laundry in the living room. I need to send a servant ahead to tell my wife that I'm bringing some people home for dinner real quick. Zacchaeus is thinking about what could be coming. But you see, the thing about Jesus is he loves you no matter how much of a mess you are, no matter how much of a mess you've got in your house. It doesn't matter the mess. Jesus loves anyway. Look at verse 6. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. Now, what's interesting is he says he hurried and came down. Climbing the tree in the first place was a very undignified thing to do. I mean, Zacchaeus is a grown man, and he's climbing a tree in the middle of the day. That was something that nobody did back then. Only unruly children did it back then. And it was looked as a shame on their parents. They can't keep control of their kids, letting them just climb trees all over the place. And here's Zacchaeus did. He climbed a tree in the middle of the day in front of everyone. And so Jesus draws attention to that fact and says, come on down, hurry and come down. But notice, Jesus tells him, hurry and come down. And the very first thing Zacchaeus does, without hesitation, it says he hurried and came down. After an experience with Jesus, an encounter with Jesus, the first thing Zacchaeus does is obey. Without reservation, he immediately obeys. And it says he received him joyfully. That is a line spoken to Zacchaeus' salvation. He receives Jesus. He accepts Jesus. He believes in Jesus and who Jesus is. See, we see the obedience, we see the acceptance. He made his way out of the tree as quickly as is possible. And once Zacchaeus is out of the tree, he receives Jesus with that great joy. You know, for Zacchaeus, somebody who's not accustomed to people being kind to him in any possible way, he experiences something in Jesus that he's not used to, something he's not accustomed to, something that's out of the ordinary, somebody speaking kindly to him. Not just that, but in front of the entire town, Jesus is doing this. And here in Jesus, he finds a display of genuine compassion. This was someone who didn't care about Zacchaeus' mess of a life, his career of immorality and deception. He didn't care that Zacchaeus had embarrassingly acted like a child and climbed up this tree. He didn't care that no one in their right mind would have associated with this tax collector. All that Jesus cared about was Zacchaeus and his destination eternally. Jesus, he extends compassion to Zacchaeus' heart. And see, the thing we're going to see about Jesus is he didn't just come to affect the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next even 100 years. Jesus came to drop a boulder in the ocean that has ripples for all eternity. And Jesus uses his long-term vision to affect great things in everyone's life. It's because of that long-term vision that things with an expiration date, like a person's likability or a person's money, or in Zacchaeus' case, how a person came about their money, those things aren't Jesus' primary concern. His concern is the heart of a person. He gets to the matter first and foremost. In this case, a person who needs to be rescued. Jesus addresses the mess. That's what we need to do. We need to address the mess in our own lives and the people around us in their lives, that everyone is desperately in need of Jesus in their lives. And Jesus, you know, he doesn't care what people think about him. He doesn't care what even his own disciples think about him in regard to speaking to this kind of man. Because of sin, everybody's life is messy. Even Zacchaeus, even his own disciples, everybody's life is messy. And the only way to keep the mess from drowning us is by seeking that extended hand of rescue that Jesus offers, just like Zacchaeus did. So Zacchaeus drops out of the tree. He starts leading the way back to his house with Jesus. The crowd is still walking along with them, almost in disbelief at this point. Look at verse 7. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. So the crowd has gone from one moment being excited to all of a sudden being greatly irritated. The crowd was beginning to question Jesus' methods, because his methods defied what was socially acceptable. You know, associations are powerful things. And in that day and time, if you associated with somebody, you took on what they were involved in. We saw this last week. Jews who associated with Gentiles had to go to a Jewish festival a week ahead of time to be purified because they had associated with Gentiles. And so here Jesus, a rabbi, the Son of God, is associating with a man who lied and stole for a living. So Jesus, in this moment, in this city, is not rising in the polls for this. People didn't like what Jesus was doing. He was lifting up someone they all thought Jesus should publicly put down. However, Jesus is not one to be swayed by other people's opinions. He is going to follow the direction of God's prompting. God wanted Jesus to show Zacchaeus love and compassion in a very public demonstration. But many people had a problem with this. Verse 8. Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." So Zacchaeus, he stands up, makes a declarative statement in this posture of declaration here, as though he's making a covenanted promise. He stands up and says this. He acknowledges his belief and his definite reliability on Jesus' power. He confesses his wrong, and he repents of his actions by his statements. You see, but for Zacchaeus, words and acknowledgement are not enough. He is going to make an action, take a bold step to back up his words. So right off, Zacchaeus promises to take half of his net worth and give it to the poor. Now, that's right off the top. That's not talking about the number he's got in the bank. That's talking about you add up everything he owns, how much it's worth. He's giving it or selling it and then giving the money to the poor. Half of everything he owns. And then on top of that, he's going to pay back every dime that he has ripped off from people times 4. And now in Leviticus 6 and in Numbers 5, the law requires repayment of somebody who stole with a 20% interest. But Zacchaeus is talking about a 400% repayment. This reveals a lot about Zacchaeus' heart. You know, if you think about him, he's about to take a significant pay cut because he is not going to steal from people anymore. On top of that, he's giving away half of all that he owns. On top of that, he's going to repay every person he's ever ripped off through his job. He is about to not be as wealthy as he had been. Because for him, committing one's heart to God is far more than empty words or gestures or even financial security. Commitment to God is a person's entire life. Verse 9, Jesus responds. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So Jesus starts off acknowledging Zacchaeus' spiritual journey. Zacchaeus has come to full faith in Jesus as his rescuer, and then Jesus calls Zacchaeus a son of Abraham. Now that, in the midst of this crowd, is a dynamic statement. Because his occupation as a chief tax collector would have been viewed by the Jews as he would have been a betrayer of his people. He would have forfeited his claim to Abraham's inheritance because he was working for the enemy. And so for Jesus to come in here and say he is a son of Abraham is a very important thing, because Jesus is doing something that Paul also did in Romans chapter 4. Jesus is talking about being a son of Abraham, not in terms of his physical heritage. You see, Abraham, according to Paul in Romans 4, and the way Jesus uses that phrase here in Luke 19, Abraham is the ancestor of all people who believe in God's plan of salvation through his son. And so though Zacchaeus is a son of Abraham physically by ancestry, more importantly, he's a son of Abraham by faith in Jesus. So Jesus makes a significant statement about his purpose in coming to the earth. You know, he came, Zacchaeus believed, became a son of Abraham, believed through faith, and then he says that the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus came to rescue people. He came to find people who do not believe in God's rescue plan and help them. This is the key reason that Jesus doesn't get into the social ills of the day or the political landscape. You know, while those things can have far-reaching ramifications, eternal ramifications are far more important. Jesus would rather spend his time pointing people to heaven than convincing them of his political position. He would rather save them from pain and punishment after death than worry about the opinions of his during his limited time on earth. Jesus, he was long-term planning here. Zacchaeus changed his perspective from what long-term planning really meant. He thought long-term planning was about accumulating all this money. And in believing in Jesus, he transitioned. It's not about money, he thought. It's about eternity with Jesus. You know, so often, some of us, we think of long-term planning as what I'm going to have for lunch, or what we are going to do tonight, or for the weekend, or next month, or we're thinking long-term planning about a trip this summer, long-term planning about saving up for our kids' college, or kids thinking about what I'm going to do in college, planning growth for our career, planning for retirement, planning for in a few years what we're going to do. You see, too often our long-term plans are in reality short-term plans in God's planning for us. We need longer-term planning. But what if, think about your life. What if you thought of long-term plannings in terms of Zacchaeus and Jesus? What if our long-term plan was eternal instead of just a few decades even? If your long-term plan was eternal, how would you save your money? How would you spend your money? If your long-term plan was eternal, how would you invest in your kids? Would you be more intentional in the time you spend together? Would you spend time daily in a family devotional? If your long-term plan was eternal, would you spend time daily reading Scripture, memorizing Scripture, and praying? If your long-term plan was eternal, how would your conversations go throughout the day? How would you talk to your spouse? How would you talk to your kids? How would you talk to your parents? How would you talk to the telemarketer who calls you and you accidentally pick up the phone? If you had an eternal long-term plan, how would your life be different from how it is right now? But you have to ask, do you have a long-term plan to begin with? Is your long-term plan eternal? Do you believe in Jesus' death and resurrection? That solidifies our long-term plan. That guarantees heaven instead of pain and punishment. That is the beginning of long-term planning. It starts with belief in Jesus, the guarantee of heaven. And we go on from there, having that decision permeate every other aspect of our lives. So what is your long-term plan? Is your long-term plan long enough?